The thing about the 1920s that I always like to point out is they are kind of the beginning of the modern, and the modern may be ending, but they're kind of the first decade that I think that if I were sent back in time, I would recognize more or less, would look kind of like the world that I live in now. That may not be true for you if you're young, because I think the internet and social media and all that has changed things, but the 1920s are the birth of the modern era. Now, there's a lot of stereotypes about the 1920s. When you think of the 20s, you might think of affluence or wealth. You might think of a conservative period, of a big party. Sometimes the 20s are talked about as if they were this giant party, and then the Great Depression in the 30s was the hangover. But as always, the reality isn't really that simple. It's far more complex and a lot darker. The 20s is one of the great periods in our history that we think of as the good old days. If we could just go back to the 20s, something like the 50s. I'm not sure we would really want to do that, actually. A new culture is going to emerge in the 1920s, and the economy is going to substantially reorganize, which is going to have big impact in the next decade. But it was also the time of a cultural war between this new society and the old America. This is a time where the transitions that have been kind of bubbling for a while now are really going to take over, and the old America that's being replaced is going to freak out. The post-war recession, the recession after World War I, ends in 1922, and it gives way to 7 years of massive growth. But like a lot of the growth in U.S. history, it is really unevenly distributed. So what's going to happen is workers' wages are not really going to go up very much. If I remember my numbers right, workers' wages go up by about 7% during the 20s, whereas the richest Americans will see their income go up by 423%. And so, as we've seen so often and we'll continue to see in the future, we do get richer as a nation, but that really only goes to the wealthiest Americans. During the 1920s, manufacturing is up 20%, per capita income is up by a third, and there's very little inflation. There is a slight dip in 1923, but that's followed by huge gains, really from 1924 to 1929. If you look at the chart there, you can see that's really the boom of the 1920s. If you also look at this chart here on the bottom right, you'll see income inequality in the U.S., and you'll see in the 1920s that spikes up, and of course it's been spiking up again ever since the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Much of the economic growth, like today, economic growth tends to revolve around computers and the internet and that sort of high technology. Well, in the 1920s, the center of this economic boom was the automobile. The assembly line massively boosted production. Ford's moving assembly line particularly massively increased how many cars we can make. And that led to booms, or that led to increases in production of steel, rubber, glass, machine tools, oil, of course, and roads. All these things created more jobs, more business opportunities, and this massive uplift to the economy. It also created another effect. It created the suburb. Now that people had a way to transport themselves from the perimeter of the city into downtown, they no longer had to pack themselves into downtown areas or limit themselves to living where there was public transportation. And so we're going to have our first housing boom. We're going to build an enormous number of houses as people who can afford it leave the city, move out into the country more or less, and then drive into work every day. And the building of the houses, of course, will be a great boon to our economy. Radios have advanced to the point now where they can carry speech and music. People have homemade shortwave and ham radios. These are kind of a hobby thing. They're over there on your left, where you can listen to more or less low-quality broadcasts from all over the world. In fact, you can't listen to close. You can only listen to far away. But soon the commercial radio is everywhere. By 1925, there are 2 million sets. And by the crash, virtually every family in America has at least one radio, similar to how ubiquitous TVs have become. We'll talk more about what's on the radio a little bit later, but understand that the radio becomes a fixture in our lives. Planes are used to deliver the mail and a joyride, barnstorming. You could go down and pay a little bit of money and go up in a plane when the barnstormers come to your community. Technological advances laid the groundwork for what will become in the 1930s the commercial airline industry. In the 1920s, we're still not yet really selling you a ticket and taking you someplace. We're basically delivering the mail and taking you just up for a joyride. Diesel-electric engines make planes faster. Diesel-electric engines make faster, cheaper trains, and so train travel becomes more efficient and cheaper. Electronics, home appliances, plastics, synthetic fibers, aluminum, oil as a fuel, and electricity all become major industries. And by the crash in 1929, there's also 25 million telephones, one telephone for every 6 people. So now it's likely that if you're middle class or better, you probably have a phone in your home. We're getting to that point. MIT develops the first analog computer in the early 1930s. It wouldn't look like a computer to you, but it's what we consider to be the first analog computer. Harvard builds a computer that has memory that can do 11-digit multiplication problems in 3 seconds. That's incredibly slow by today's standards, but blew everybody's mind back in the day. Gregor Mendel, back in the middle of the 18th century, had discovered that you could crossbreed plants to create new species of plants. And that's going to lead his work eventually to genetic research. And we're going to begin to develop basic theories of genetics and inherited traits and those sorts of things during the 1920s. Capital-intensive industry, that means industry that requires a lot of money to start up, factories typically, will move our economy towards oligopoly. If you're thinking about farmers, it's very easy to start a farm and compete with the other farmers. But if you're talking about a car company, it takes a lot of money and effort to start a car company. And so there's only a few, really. And this, of course, destroys competition. There wasn't true market competition. Now, when there's not competition, the market doesn't know how much to produce and what to charge for it. And so this can lead to overproduction. Overproduction, by the way, due to monopolies, were what caused the crashes of 1893, 1907, and 1920. And there begins to be a strong argument among economists that we either need to have more competition or we need to have government regulation of the economy, because once you remove the market mechanism, because you have monopolies or oligopolies, then the economy doesn't really know what to do, and it keeps collapsing.